Hey guys, welcome back for another Lit Review where I talk about scientific journal articles. Today, the paper that we're going to talk about is the Biomechanics of First Rate, Part 1, the effects of Peroneus Longus function of three-dimensional kinematic study on cadaver models. This was published by Dr. Christensen and Dr. Johnson. It is kind of an old paper. It is published in 1999, and it basically talks about two things, first ray and Peroneus Longus. So what is a first ray? So we classically learn a first ray as the first metatarsal and medial cuneiform. We also include hallux. That's the way I learned it, kind of because it's basically the whole thing. Mechanical device that allows your toe to basically flex, plantar flex, and dorsiflex when it's needed. And that's required when you're walking. So first ray is basically that all those bones over there on the first, that includes the first toe, first metatarsal and medial cuneiform. And there's a lot of foot pathology that happen with abnormal movement of first ray. And if you get too much movement, we call that hypermobility. And hypermobility, based on this paper, is defined as three things. You obviously get the hypermobile joint movement, meaning you're gonna get a lot of dorsiflexion or plantar flexion. And you could kind of measure by first ray analysis, evaluation. So when they come in, you can grab their foot by the one hand on the first metatarsal head, and then the other hand on the lesser metatarsal, 2 through 5, and you raise up and down. And we call that dorsal excursion when you're putting up, and plantar excursion when you're putting it down. And generally, within a normal limit, it should be 5 millimeter up, and dorsal excursion 5 millimeter down. But in cases of hypermobile first ray, you will kind of get about 9 millimeter of dorsal excursion. That's what the paper said, based on the previous research. And also, secondly, you're gonna get an increased gapping distance between the first and the second cuneiform. And thirdly, you're gonna get a thickening of a second metatarsal head. So when I read that, that was like a new thing to me, because everyone thinks of hypermobile first ray as like, oh yeah, it moves more than it should. That makes sense, but those two things are also kind of the thing, telltale sign that is hypermobility. There's hypermobility in the first ray. And that, why do you get increased gapping of the first cuneiform and second cuneiform, and the thickening of the second metatarsal is because first ray is unable to do its job properly, meaning it's unable to get the force on the ground when it's walking and kind of become a rigid lever and allow the foot to be in a proper position when it's walking. So the force is translated to the second metatarsal, and you obviously gotta get a thickening of the second metatarsal shaft because there's increased pressure on it, and there's based on Wolff's law, you're gonna get bone adaptation, and also the force is gonna be abnormal, so there's gonna be increased gapping between the first and second cuneiform. That's what I think. So those three things are key. Obviously, more movement than usually it has. Obviously, that's the first thing in hypermobility, and second is increased gapping between the first and second cuneiform, and thickening of the second metatarsal, the cortices, second metatarsal shaft. I remember when I visited a residency program, they asked, what is hypermobile first ray? I gave them the obvious answer, there's an increased movement out of the normal limits. The residency director was looking for more than that, so I guess he was looking for the fact that there's increased gapping between the first and the second cuneiform and the second metatarsal shaft. I'm repeating that a lot because I think it was like the first time I read it, I thought it was pretty interesting, so know that. So that's the first ray. So now that we talked about first ray, let's talk about Peroneus longus, which is the second half of the paper. So Peroneus longus is a muscle that is located laterally that originates from the lateral head of the fibula, goes down, and once it goes down to 1/3 lower, the inferior part of the leg, it becomes tendon structure, which travels under the laterals malleolus, inferior to Peroneus brevis, and then goes around the peroneal tubercle of the calcaneus, and then goes around the cuboid, and then it inserts laterally to the first metatarsal, and base of the first metatarsal, and the medial cuneiform. The origin and insertion is important for any muscle because it basically tells you how the muscle is going to act on the given joint. So there's a lot of joints happening. It crosses the ankle joint, it crosses a lot of tarsal, metatarsal joints. So that's that. So the author just also talks about just the function of a Peroneus longus. So what is the job of what does Peroneus longus do for us in our feet? it maintains the normal structure of the foot by maintaining a balance between anterior tibialis and anterior tibialis. They are able to maintain that normal arch. For example, if your anterior tibialis overpowers Peroneus longus, and what you're gonna get is overactivation of this, and you basically gonna get, well, this is, for example, right foot overactivation, because you're gonna get dorsiflexion and inversion, because anterior tibialis, unlike Peroneus longus, attaches medially. You're gonna get something like this. So you're gonna basically get a flat foot overactivation of anterior tibialis compared to the Peroneus longus. And conversely, if a Peroneus longus is overpowering anterior tibialis, you're gonna get a pull like this because it's attached laterally, it kind of flexes it. So you're going to get an arch type foot with an overcontracture of Peroneus longus. Sometimes you're gonna see like CMT Charcot-Marie 2. There's kind of example here with that with the high arch foot. They talk about that also. Yeah, so that's what you get. So Peroneus longus is to maintain foot shape basically in everyone. Now they go on to talk about how previously, I guess previous to 1999, Peroneus longus has not been really talked about or really studied. It is much more of an observation. No one has really done a study on what Peroneus longus actually does on a biomechanical level. So that's why this paper is doing what it's doing. What they did was the authors of the paper took 7 fresh frozen cadavers and basically got their foot and created a custom design device where it applies about 40 kilograms or 400 Newton pressure on the shaft of the lower leg and kind of simulate a mid-stand phase of the foot. And they are doing that by loading the foot with 400 Newtons and without activating the Peroneus longus. So they're activating all the other muscles and tendons and then the bone without touching Peroneus longus. Now they attach electrical clamps on Peroneus longus tendon, and they could kind of modulate how much force they could allow Peroneus longus to apply. They could do 50%, 100%, 150%. So by doing that, they are contracting the Peroneus longus tendon and seeing how it's affecting the foot during mid-stand. So this is close kinetic study, right? They did that, and what they found out was Peroneus longus plantarflexes and everts the first metatarsal. That makes sense because of the attachment. If you look from the laterally, it attaches right here. So plantarflexes and everts. It pulls up, right? Because remember, it comes from the lateral side under the foot like that. So kind of plantarflexes. Plantarflexion makes sense, and then everts because it attaches lateral to the medial cuneiform in the first metatarsal. So it makes sense. Plantarflexes and everts. Around the eversion angle is about 8 degrees. That's what the study found. Now they look at proximal to first metatarsal, medial cuneiform. Now Peroneus longus also attaches to medial cuneiform laterally. So what do you think? Plantarflexes everts makes sense, but the eversion angle is actually about a little bit less, 7 degrees. Looking more proximally, navicular. It does not have any attachment to Peroneus longus, but what it is doing is it is everting like the other distal bone, like the first metatarsal and medial cuneiform, but instead of plantarflexing, it's dorsiflexing. And that makes sense because in a bone, if one goes down, the other one will try to go up. And it's the same concept how if the rear foot is kind of everted, forefoot will be inverted. If the forefoot is everted, rear foot is inverted. It's basically a compensatory mechanism for your foot to maintain balance. And it makes sense if one goes down, as bones kind of rubbing against each other, the other one will naturally be up. And I think that's what's happening here, where the medial cuneiform, which is distal to the navicular, is essentially going plantarflexing it because of the direct attachment to the Peroneus longus, and the navicular is actually kind of rising up. Makes sense. Talus also dorsiflexes and abducts and plantarflexes. I apologize. So talus, which is even more distal, proximal to the first metatarsal, abducts, dorsiflexes, and everts. That makes sense. So the angle for the eversion that was studied on the paper was that the medial cuneiform everts around 7 degrees, less than the 8th degree of the first metatarsal. Navicular everts around 4.7 degrees, which is even more than the medial cuneiform, and talus everts around 4.4 everts compared to the navicular, which is even less. So the eversion goes down as it becomes proximal. So that's the study, and they basically found out, hey, Peroneus longus definitely plantarflexes and everts, and this is the first study kind of establishing that. Like I said before, there's been other studies, observational kind of, just people noticing that, hey, it does plantarflexion and eversion, but this is the first kind of paper that basically definitely states this is what they do because we did a study on it. That's pretty cool. Now, as a discussion, what's happening? What's the job of Peroneus longus? So it's everting and plantarflexing. What's the big deal? But remember, this is happening in mid-stance, and the importance of mid-stance is to basically transition from a bag of bones to a rigid lever. So when your foot is walking, when your first heel strike, your foot is needs to adapt to the floor it's hitting. So it's going to be a bag of bone. It's not going to be a rigid lever, because if it's a rigid lever, it could break. So it's a loose bag of bone, like my teacher says often. And once it makes contact, it needs to immediately become a rigid lever so that you could go into propulsion or go into heel lift, right? And so on. So the Peroneus longus, what it's doing is allowing that transition to happen by tightening the ligamentous structure in the medial column, which includes first ray. And by doing a plantarflexion eversion and creating that eversion throughout the first ray, it is transferring that torsional force from proximal to distally. So you can see that from the angles, 8 degrees, 7 degrees, 4.7, 4.4. The torsion force is becoming reduced until basically all the bones of the first ray or the medial column basically get locked up. And then the tightening of the ligaments can happen also. And that makes the whole bone basically a locked structure, which is basically a rigid lever, which allows for your foot to go on to propulsion or heel loft. And that's basically the function of a Peroneus longus, and this paper kind of elucidates definitely, without any question, how it's doing that using an actual cadaver model. So, like I said, this is the first part of 5 papers. I'll soon talk about the second part, which kind of evolves around kind of this idea of first ray. So stay tuned. I hope you guys enjoyed this video. Please leave a comment about how I can improve going over paper articles. And thanks for watching.